Now, Northern Ireland, of course, is an exception to all the generalisations we tend to make about Britain. You know, the first generalisation we often make about Britain is that Britain is an island. But in fact, the United Kingdom is an island with part of another island that is part of the island of Ireland. And the official name of our state is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So it's an island and part of another island. It's also often said that our borders have existed from time immemorial and that we've evolved through the centuries. But in fact, the borders of the United Kingdom date from 1921, when a treaty was signed with Irish nationalist representatives by which the whole of Ireland, except for Northern Ireland, ceased to be ruled by Westminster. And before that, before 1921, the United Kingdom consisted of the whole of two islands, Great Britain and Ireland. So our grandparents lived under a United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, whereas we live under United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Now, this treaty, it's called a treaty, but it was not signed with an independent state. It was signed with the leaders of a nationalist guerrilla movement in Ireland, and it masks the fact that one part of the United Kingdom, the 26 counties which today form the Irish Republic, they seceded after a violent struggle with the British authorities. We fought a guerrilla war with them, which we lost in effect, and we ceded most of the island of Ireland. And that makes us, I think, unique amongst the countries of Western Europe, and it's often forgotten when we talk, as we often do, about our evolutionary and stable constitutional progress. And so Ireland is an exception to every generalisation. And Northern Ireland is also often forgotten when we make generalisations about the stability of our institutions and our general tolerance. The British on the whole, the rest of the British, don't think much about Northern Ireland, and when they do, they tend not to be very enthusiastic about it. The English, it is England alone, since 1983, opinion polls in England have shown a steady majority for Northern Ireland not to be part of the United Kingdom, to be ceded to the Irish Republic. The majority of English respondents in polls since 1983 do not want Northern Ireland to be part of the United Kingdom. The difficulty is the people of Northern Ireland do want to remain part of the United Kingdom. So Northern Ireland seems unloved, unwanted, and forgotten. Now, how did it come to remain part of the United Kingdom? Why were those 6 counties left out of the settlement with the rest of Ireland? Now, in order to answer this question, we have to go back to the history of Northern Ireland. And indeed, Northern Ireland is more drenched in history, I think, than any other part of the United Kingdom. And when in 1921 Lloyd George was the Prime Minister was trying to get a settlement with the Irish, he met with the Irish nationalist leader, De Valera, to try and get a discussion of Irish grievances. And he began by saying, let's put things on the table. What precisely are the grievances of the Irish? And De Valera replied, well, if you look at the time of Cromwell, and it took a long time to get to the present, so it's all very much drenched in history. Now, of course, in Northern Ireland, it still matters whether someone is a Protestant or a Catholic, in a way it doesn't matter anywhere else in the United Kingdom. It ceased to matter in Britain since at least before the First World War. And religion matters in Northern Ireland because it's associated with national claims. The Protestants, almost all of them, want to remain within the United Kingdom. They are unionists, and unionist is another word in a way for Protestant. They want to preserve the union between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. But many of the Catholics, perhaps the majority, by contrast, would prefer to unite with the Republic of Ireland. They are nationalists. Now, religion combined with nationalism makes for an intractable combination. In Northern Ireland, religion and nationalism are really different ways of saying the same thing. The same is true in another intractable area in the world, in the Middle East, where to be an Israeli, or at least a first-class citizen of the Israeli, is to be Jewish, and to be an Arab is to be a Muslim citizen. And so religion and nationalism combined there, so it's highly intractable. And the reason being, it's very difficult to get a bargain or agreement amongst people who believe in absolutes. Now, in the rest of the United Kingdom, we might disagree quite strongly about issues such as the National Health Service or education, but we can usually arrive at some sort of compromise or bargain which gives each side a little of what it wants. But you can't bargain in the case of religion or nationalism. You can't be half a Catholic or half a British citizen. You either are or you aren't. There's no seemingly middle position. Now, in Ireland, as opposed to the rest of the two islands of Ireland and Britain, in Ireland, the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, never really took root. And the majority on that island of Ireland remained Catholic. But nevertheless, there has been, for a long period of time, a significant Protestant presence in Ireland. Now, if you ask me how long there's been that Protestant presence, that is a subject on which historians disagree. Protestant historians will tell you there's always been a Protestant presence in Ireland. Catholic historians will say that the Protestants were planted there by the British to keep the Catholics down, and that there hasn't always been a Protestant presence. However, there is at least agreement that there's been a strong Protestant presence since the 17th century, and that Protestant presence was particularly strong in the northeast, where people from Scotland had settled in what is now Northern Ireland. And the Protestants in Ireland always called themselves the British in Ireland. And they regarded the Catholics as disloyal citizens, as many people in this part of the water did in the 17th century. The Catholics were disloyal. We still have the Act of Settlement by which no Catholic can become queen or king of the head of state, and any member of the royal family who marries a Catholic loses their position in the succession. So the Protestants regarded the Catholics as disloyal, but the Catholics thought the Protestants were colonisers from the British, planted in Ireland to hold the Catholic population down as second-class citizens. Now, from the 18th century, there was a growing sense of Irish identity and Irish nationalism, and that exacerbated the differences and increased the conflict between the two groups. And in 1886, a Liberal Prime Minister, Gladstone, introduced a policy of home rule for Ireland, what we now, I think, call devolution, a very wide level of devolution, to an Irish Parliament situated in Dublin. And that was strongly resisted by the Protestants, and from that time the terms Protestant and Unionist have become interchangeable. And the Protestants were strongly supported by the Conservative Party, which for a long time called themselves the Unionist Party, though they ceased to do that in 1922 when the union with Ireland had broken. I was speaking some while ago to a friend of mine who had stood as a young man as a Liberal candidate in Northern Ireland in the constituency of North Antrim, which has been represented for many years by the Reverend Paisley, and needless to say he lost his deposit there. But he was sitting in a hotel one morning having coffee, and a very young boy, a 12-year-old boy I think it was, came up to him and said, "Now, are you the Liberal candidate for North Antrim?" And he said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "Now tell me, wasn't Gladstone a Liberal?" And he said, "Yes, he was." And he said, "Now look, if Gladstone's Home Rule had been passed, wouldn't the situation in Northern Ireland perhaps be a bit better now than it actually is?" And my friend actually said, "Yes, I think it would be." That just shows that history is something very deep in Ireland and understood even by very young people. I don't think you get many 12-year-olds on this side of the water asking candidates about Mr. Gladstone. But now, the Protestants resisted Home Rule in Ireland. And some said this showed there wasn't just one nation in Ireland, a Catholic nation, but two nations, a Catholic nation and a Protestant nation. But that's not quite right, because the Protestants did not and do not see themselves as a separate nation, but they see themselves as a part of the British nation. They said they're not part of the Irish nation. If there is an Irish nation, it's subordinate to the British nation, and that they themselves are fundamentally British and don't want to be anything else. They are Unionists and call themselves British. Indeed, they're amongst the few in the United Kingdom who still call themselves British. The Scots now call themselves Scots, the Welsh, Welsh. The English are increasingly call themselves English to mark themselves off from the Scots and Welsh who have devolution. But the Northern Irish Protestants call themselves British, not Irish or Northern Irish, but British. And they certainly don't seek independence for Northern Ireland. They seek to maintain the union with the rest of Britain, and that is a position of equal citizenship. That's what they want, a position of equal citizenship with everyone else in the country. And this, I think, has made it very difficult for any government to resist their claims, because they weren't asking, as the Irish nationalists were, for a special privilege for home rule or independence. They were only asking that their position in the United Kingdom be left undisturbed. They didn't themselves want home rule or devolution or anything like that. They wanted to be treated in exactly the same way as someone living in Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham or London, to accept the same obligations, the same rights as everyone else. And they said, if you pass home rule or independence against our wishes, you are expelling us from the United Kingdom against our wishes. And you are saying, the governments in London are saying, the Irish should have the right of self-determination. Well, surely we too, as unionist people, we should have our own right of self-determination, only we're not asking for special privileges or advantages. All we're asking is that we can remain what we've always been, British citizens. We don't ask for any special privileges that aren't enjoyed by people in Birmingham or Manchester or in London or anywhere else. So it's very difficult, in fact, to resist. But at any rate, I hope this shows that someone once said about devolution that it was 4 nations and a funeral. It turned the United Kingdom's 4 nations and a funeral. But you see, whatever you think of devolution, that's wrong. They're not 4 nations. There are 3 nations, the British, Welsh and the Scots, and a 4th part, the majority of whom claim to be part of the British nation. Many of the minority say they're part of the Irish nation. There's no Northern Irish nation. But they're different allegiances, conflicting allegiances. Now, the Unionists, the Protestants in Ireland, in the south of Ireland, they were a scattered minority and really powerless to resist home rule or independence. But in the northeast of Ireland, where the Scots had mainly settled, they were a very compact majority, and they could resist home rule for Ireland, resist it by physical force if necessary, and they threatened to do that. They said they would not respect the law, that if an act was passed establishing a parliament in Dublin, they would declare a UDI, Unilateral Declaration of Independence. They would fight. They would fight the law because they had a higher loyalty to the British nation. They were, as they put it, the king's rebels. They were rebelling in the name of their allegiance to the king. They said they would not accept home rule, even if passed by Parliament. And that created a crisis which tended to paralyse government in the first 2 decades of this century. But eventually it was settled by Lloyd George with great political skill in the coalition government which ruled Britain from 1918 to 22. And I think it's significant it was a coalition. I think it would have been very difficult for a party government of the left or right to settle it. But Lloyd George was a liberal, but he was the head of a coalition in which the majority were conservatives, so he could bind the conservatives into the settlement. And he made 3 crucial decisions, or his government made 3 crucial decisions, which made Northern Ireland what it is today. First, he decided that you couldn't force the Unionists into United Ireland. You might want to do so, you might think that was a sensible thing for them, but they simply said no, never, the way Ian Paisley says never, and you couldn't force them into United Ireland. And that meant, therefore, you had to partition Ireland. You had to divide it into 2 parts, one of which would be independent, the other of which would remain British. Now, the second question was, what should the size of the excluded area be, the area that was going to remain British? And in the end, the excluded area was to comprise, as it still does, 6 counties of Northern Ireland. 4 of them had large Protestant majorities. They were Antrim, Armagh, Down and Londonderry. And Londonderry is called by the nationalists Derry for obvious reasons, but it's the same place. You call it either Londonderry or Derry. It shows the difficulties of the Northern Ireland problem. The way you name things shows whether you're a unionist or a nationalist. And I'll use both names so as not to cause difficulties. Antrim, Armagh, Down, Londonderry, Derry. But there were also 2 counties with a very narrow Catholic majority, Fermanagh and Tyrone, the border counties. Now, these 6 excluded counties are sometimes called Ulster, but in fact the province of Ulster is 9 counties. And there are 3 counties of Ulster which are in the Republic, Cavan, Donegal and Monaghan. So the settlement partitions Ulster as well as the island of Ireland. It's not the whole of Ulster, it's part of Ulster, 6 counties of Ulster. And you may say, why those 6 counties, why not the whole 9 counties? And the answer is this, that the 9 counties had a very narrow Protestant majority. And the Protestants, the Unionists, were worried that that majority wouldn't last. It would be turned into a Catholic majority. Catholics at that time, I think, still possibly have a higher birth rate, a Catholic majority, and then it would vote to join the Republic, so they would lose out. So they said, we don't want all the 9 counties. We want the 6 counties. The 6 counties was the largest unit, really, that they could hold, they thought. The 9 counties wouldn't be safe. The 6 counties they could hold. Now, the nationalists said they didn't accept partition at all, but they said if you have it at all, you should only have the 4 counties with Protestant majorities. In the end, the British government said the 6 counties is right, and they said this for a reason which now looks rather odd, I think. They said in the 6 counties there'll be a solid Protestant majority, about 2 to 1 it was then. It's now about 60 to 40, then about 66 to 33, about 2 to 1. And they said if there's a solid Protestant majority, there won't be the same temptation to treat the Catholics badly as if you have a small Protestant majority. If you have a small Protestant majority, the Protestants will always be fearful of any concessions to the Catholics that will lead them into the Irish Republic. If you have a large majority, both sides will know they have to work it, and therefore the British government said they'll be more tolerant. Well, that didn't prove to be the case, but that's what they thought at the time. But what you can see, in a sense, is that Northern Ireland is, in one sense, an artificial unit. It's simply the largest area which the Unionists thought they could control. It has no other sort of logic, as the province of Ulster would have a certain logic. So those are the first 2 decisions. You partition Ireland, and secondly, you say that it's partitioned along the line of the 6 counties, which remain British. But the third decision was that these 6 counties should not be governed from Westminster, as the Unionists then wanted, but it should have its own devolved parliament, a Home Rule parliament. It's a paradox that Northern Ireland, which strongly resisted Home Rule, had a Home Rule parliament forced on it, which its people did not want. And the reason the British government did that was that they too hoped that eventually Northern Ireland would join the Republic, and they said if we give Northern Ireland devolution, Home Rule, it'll realise its future really lies in Ireland and not with Britain, and then we'll be rid of the whole problem and get rid of it. It's a paradox that the one part of Ireland which so strongly resisted Home Rule had a Home Rule parliament imposed on it. Now, once the Unionists had their parliament in the 20s, they saw this could be rather useful because it could act as a veto upon any Westminster politicians who were trying to settle with the Republic over the heads of the Unionist politicians. And they said, you cannot make any decision about Northern Ireland without the consent of our Parliament here. A majority at Westminster isn't enough, you also need our consent, and we will never give it because we have a permanent Unionist majority, so it's a veto. And they accepted it in a famous phrase, they accepted it as a supreme sacrifice. Odd to say that having your parliament is a supreme sacrifice and a final settlement of the Irish problem. Now, in the sense in which the Lloyd George answer, these 3 points, the partition, the 6 counties excluded area, the Northern Ireland Parliament, the sense in which it was a settlement of sorts, but it wasn't, as is clear now, a total solution to the Irish problem. Now, it might possibly have been a solution if the Unionists in Northern Ireland had adopted the kind of tolerant approach to the nationalist population that the British government hoped would be adopted. But in fact they didn't. And they had a reason for that. I'm not saying a justification, but a reason. Because they said the nationalists, wherever they get control, will try and push Northern Ireland into the Republic. And indeed, when nationalists got control of the border councils, they raised the Irish flag there and tried to avoid recognising the jurisdiction of the British government. So they said the nationalists are not a loyal opposition in the way that, say, the Conservatives are in Britain today. They're a disloyal opposition, a threat to the state. And they used that as a justification to treat them, in effect, as second-class citizens. And the problem worsened when, in 1937, the Irish drew up a new constitution which explicitly laid claim to the whole island of Ireland. This was De Valera's constitution. And the Unionists said, you see, this justifies what we're doing. The Catholics are a disloyal minority, can't be trusted. And there was widespread discrimination against Catholics in Northern Ireland, especially in housing allocation. And there was also widespread gerrymandering of constituencies to ensure that the Catholics were a minority in the voting, even when they were a majority of the citizens. And this went on for about 45 years, on the whole, unchallenged. But in the late 1960s, you had a new generation of Catholics, professionals, better educated, less deferential, less willing to accept the restrictions that their parents had perhaps accepted. And with the civil rights movement being of importance in many parts of the world, it erupted in Northern Ireland. And the Unionist majority reacted fairly brutally to that. And this was when Ian Paisley first gained his reputation by really inciting the Unionists to remove Catholics from mixed areas of housing and push them into ghettos in Northern Ireland. He incited really Protestant religious fervour when it was perhaps beginning to die down. He first came to public notice during that period. Now, these problems meant the British government, which wanted to turn its back on Northern Ireland, had to face up to what was going on. And under Edward Heath, the Conservative Prime Minister, in 1972, the British government abolished the Northern Ireland Parliament and ruled Northern Ireland directly from Westminster under a Northern Ireland Secretary, as before devolution Scotland and Wales were ruled by a Scottish and Welsh Secretary. And this seemed to many a desirable solution to integrate Northern Ireland within the United Kingdom. And many people said, well, this is a good thing now because the Northern Irish will be treated just as the Scots and Welsh and everyone else is as part of the United Kingdom. But in fact, it was not a solution for a reason that I will describe. Because the party system in Northern Ireland is quite different from that in Scotland and Wales. Now, in Scotland and Wales, as well as the nationalist parties, you have, of course, Labour, Conservative and Liberal parties, so the party system's integrated with the rest of the United Kingdom. But you don't really have much of a Labour, Conservative or Liberal party in Northern Ireland. Now, the Labour Party tried to found a Labour Party of Northern Ireland many years ago, but it proved impossible because the first question people asked was, where do you stand on the border? And if you said you were in favour of the border, you were a unionist. If you were against the border, you were a nationalist. There was no chance of getting united trade union or working class support for a Labour Party in Northern Ireland in the way you could in Britain. I mean, if you were in Liverpool in the Labour Party, no one cared whether you're Protestant or Catholic. If you were Glasgow, no one cared whether you're Protestant. You had a united Labour Party representing the trade unions, the organised working class. You couldn't do that in Northern Ireland because the working class was split between the Protestant working class and the Catholic working class, and that division was more important to them than, if you like, the class conflict with their employers. So Northern Ireland remains the one part of the United Kingdom where you cannot join the Labour Party. You are not allowed to join the Labour Party if you are resident in Northern Ireland, and the Labour Party does not contest elections in Northern Ireland. Now, the Conservatives, until 1989, had no constituency associations in Northern Ireland either, and they did not accept membership from anyone residing there. Now they do, and there are some constituency associations, but Conservatives receive only a derisory vote. The majority of the Protestant vote that would go to Conservatives goes to Unionists, and similarly the Catholic vote would go to the Nationalists. Now, the Liberals also got nowhere in Northern Ireland. They couldn't win Unionist votes because of their Gladstonian tradition of support for Home Rule. And they couldn't win Nationalist votes because Nationalists preferred to vote for Republican parties. And now, the Liberal Democrats do have a sister party in Northern Ireland, which is called the Alliance Party. And the Alliance Party is a biconfessional party. That is, it's neither Unionist nor Nationalist, but it says the border should remain as long as there's consent for it. So to that extent, I suppose it is a Unionist party. But they do seek to get support from both sides of what you might call the tribal divide. But you won't be surprised to hear that they don't get much support and that they're very much a minority party, even more than the Liberal Democrats on this part of the water. And the Liberal Democrats themselves don't contest elections in Northern Ireland, so they don't split the vote with the Alliance. So none of the three main British parties, in effect, contest elections in Northern Ireland. Now, what this means is that the voters in Northern Ireland have no say on who forms a British government. They can't decide to vote for Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, Mingus Campbell, whatever it is. They're voting for unionist and nationalist parties, which clearly aren't going to form the government in the United Kingdom. They play no part, except when there's a hung parliament, and if there's a hung parliament, of course, they do have a lot of influence. But elections in Northern Ireland are not about who forms the government. They're about the balance of representation between the Unionists and the Nationalists. So in that sense, Northern Ireland is very different from Scotland and Wales, which of course do play a part in helping to elect a government. Now, it follows from this that the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, who is at present Peter Hain, can never be representative of the area which he's responsible. Now, Peter Hain belongs to the Labour Party. There are no Labour MPs in Northern Ireland. Now, it's true when the Conservatives are in office, they tend to be in a minority in Scotland and Wales, but at least there are some Conservative MPs from Scotland and Wales when the Conservatives form a government. And, of course, when Labour forms a government, they're in a majority in Scotland and Wales. But there are simply no Labour or Conservative MPs from Northern Ireland. And one previous Northern Ireland secretary in the 1980s, James Pryor, said he felt as though I was a foreigner in another land. He had no political support there. And so this left a political vacuum which the extremists could exploit. And Sinn Féin, the Republican movement, could say it was a form of colonial rule by the British, that Northern Ireland took on the character of a dependency incapable of self-government. And furthermore, integration would make the nationalist minority feel they couldn't express their claims at all, and it made it difficult, if not impossible, to get the cooperation of the Irish Republic in solving the problems of Northern Ireland. So, in the view of most British governments, it would make it impossible to defeat terrorism. Now, it's for these reasons that every British government, since direct rule was imposed in the early 1970s, British governments, whether Labour or Conservative, it's a bipartisan policy, that every British government has sought to restore devolution to Northern Ireland, but not the form of devolution it had before, where the Protestants were in the majority and ran things. That's not acceptable. There must be a different form of devolution, namely a power-sharing or partnership form of devolution, in which both the nationalist minority and the unionist majority share power in government. It's as if you said you couldn't form a government at Westminster unless you have Tony Blair and David Cameron together in the government, a coalition, a grand coalition, if you like, covering all the main groups. Otherwise, the British governments have said, Catholics will again be treated as second-class citizens and will have terrorism all over again. So the minority has to be part of the executive rather than in permanent opposition. Because, of course, again, political circumstances in Northern Ireland differ from those in the rest of the country. Because in the rest of the country, there is a swing of the pendulum. We can all console ourselves if our party is defeated, it may win next time. And even when you had 18 years of Conservative government in 1979 to 1997, there was always the feeling that you might get a change of government, and this was a constraint upon what government was doing. But of course that's not the case in Northern Ireland, where voting is determined by fundamental religious and nationalist allegiance. And the parties which represent the Protestant majority will always be in power in Northern Ireland, and the Catholic Party will always be a minority. So the Westminster type of system will not work there. You have a permanent majority based on a kind of tribal division, and it simply won't work. You won't get a swing of the pendulum. And this has fundamental consequences because in Britain, generally speaking, there's a tendency of parties, if they want to win elections, to try and win over the centre ground, the floating voter. Now, I don't know whether any of you watched, it wasn't a very good programme last night about David Cameron on Channel 4. I thought not a very good programme. But the person who was preparing it, a journalist called Peter Hitchens, was complaining that Cameron was abandoning fundamental Conservative principles and trying to win over the middle ground. Well, that seems to me sensible if you've just lost 3 elections. There's something wrong somewhere. And you don't go on offering the same. I think David Frum, who was George Bush's speechwriter, once characterised the psychology of losing parties to say you offer the voters ham and eggs and they say no thank you, so you say what about double ham and double eggs then? That won't work. And similarly, the Labour Party in opposition, it took them quite a while to learn that you had to appeal to the centre ground if you were going to win elections, Blair, New Labour, and Cameron is trying to do the same for the Conservatives. Now, of course, in Northern Ireland there is no centre floating vote. A Protestant Unionist party won't win votes from Catholic nationalists, and the Catholics won't win votes from the Protestants. But the floating vote is on the extremes, because you can always be outflanked in the way that Paisley has outflanked the other Unionist parties, or Gerry Adams outflanked the other nationalist parties by saying they're selling out your community. They're not defending you as toughly as I would. See, the floating vote in Northern Ireland is on the extremes. And this explains, I think, why it is that the moderate party has been pushed out, and you've got to Paisley and Gerry Adams, and difficult to get to a greater extreme, so they have to settle. The moderate parties no longer really have the same weight. And as I said, the biconfessional party, the Alliance Party in the centre, gets absolutely nowhere. So the political conditions in Northern Ireland are, again, fundamentally different from those in the rest of the United Kingdom, so you have different political arrangements to accommodate those differences. Now, the settlement, which was endorsed, we hope, yesterday, is based on the Belfast or Good Friday Agreement of 1998. And this agreement has two fundamental features in it, which are great departures from the Westminster model of government. And the first I've already alluded to is a form of partnership government, and a recognition of the fact that you cannot govern a divided society through the Westminster model of alternating majorities, but only through partnership. So the two parts of the community, the Unionists and Nationalists, must share power so that neither feels left out in the cold. And the second great departure is the recognition that a solution cannot be purely internal, because many Catholics in Northern Ireland feel Irish rather than British, and therefore there must be some recognition of the Irish dimension, some form of connection with the Republic. On the other hand, that mustn't involve the cession of sovereignty, because that wouldn't be acceptable to the Protestants. So it's a very difficult balancing act. But what we're doing here is we're differing, in a sense, from the other constitution reforms, which I mentioned, which are solely internal within the United Kingdom, Scotland, Scottish-Welsh devolution, whatever you think, they're internal matters for the United Kingdom. This isn't just internal to the United Kingdom, it's both internal but also external in relation to the Irish Republic. And you can only do it if you accept the proposition that the sovereign national state may have to be superseded. If you think the sovereign national state is the only thing, you can't go beyond it, you can't deal with the problems of Ireland. But in a sense, we have, in one sense, superseded it through joining the European Union, a multinational organisation, superior legal order. We're also doing it in Ireland. We're superseding the idea that the national sovereign state is the ultimate entity. And let me describe these two aspects of the agreement in some more detail. These are the two fundamental principles, I think. The proposal in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement is there should be an assembly of 108 members in Northern Ireland, elected by the single transferable vote method of proportional representation for 4 years, and that this should have legislative powers, powers to make laws, as the Scottish Parliament does. But as I've already indicated, the crucial difference with the Scottish Parliament is that the executive, the government, can only be formed in Northern Ireland with the consent of both communities, the Unionists and the Nationalists, and all legislation requires the consent of both communities. The majority can't pass any legislation or form a government on its own. And there's a very complicated mechanism to secure this, which I won't go into, but let me just say this, that the First Minister, the head of the government, and the Deputy require to be elected a majority in each community, the representatives of each community, as well as a majority of the whole. So in other words, Ian Paisley, if he's going to be the First Minister, he needs a majority of the whole Assembly, plus a majority of the Unionists, which of course he'll get, but also a majority of the Nationalists. And that is yoked together with the election of a Deputy First Minister, which will be Gerry Adams, who also requires support of the majority of the Assembly as a whole, support of the majority of the Nationalists, which of course he'll get, and support of the majority of the Unionists. And without both of those, you can't have an executive. Now then, they hold office jointly, and if one of them goes, the other goes. It's like a pantomime horse, if you like. They're together. They can't be separated. Now, unlike the British cabinets, they don't then appoint the other ministers. I mean, once Blair is elected, he appoints who he wants to his cabinet. They don't appoint the other ministers. The other ministers are appointed in proportion to their strengths in the Assembly. Thus, the Unionist Party, the Democratic Unionists have 4 seats. The Sinn Féin have 3 seats, and the other Unionist and Nationalist parties similarly in an executive of 11. And I say it's an odd system, you can imagine what it would be like at Westminster if we had a government led by Tony Blair, with David Cameron as Deputy Prime Minister and the rest of the Cabinet in proportion to party strength. So you'd have so many Labour, so many Conservatives, a few Liberals, perhaps one or two Nationalists and so on. It's an odd form of government. And as I say, it requires Ian Paisley to work with his bitter enemies. I now want to come on to the external part of the solution, which has two aspects to it. One to reconcile the Catholics, the Nationalists, and the other to reconcile the Unionists, the Protestants. And the first to reconcile the Catholics is the so-called Irish dimension. And that involves a North-South ministerial council. There's a council, a representative of the Northern Ireland Assembly and the government of the Republic. Now, this is purely advisory. It has no decision-making powers. But it brings together these representatives of both parts of the island to work together on matters of mutual interest. Now, they can make decisions only if there's unanimity, if both sides agree. They can't otherwise. So that gives those in Northern Ireland a veto over what is done, and that gives the Protestants a veto. But nevertheless, it does recognise the Irish identity of the minority. And furthermore, those living in Northern Ireland can, if they wish, hold Irish citizenship as well as British citizenship if they choose. They can hold dual citizenship. It's a recognition, if you like, of the Irish identity of the Catholic, so some of the Catholic population. It's a cross-border body. However, to mollify the Unionists, another body was created called the British Irish Council. Now, the North-South Council is north of Ireland and the south. The British Irish Council is an east-west body, and that comprises the ministers of the United Kingdom and of the Irish Republic, the two governments on these islands, together with leaders of the various devolved bodies in the United Kingdom, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, plus, for some reason, the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man. Discuss matters of mutual interest. That is entirely consulted. That cannot make any decisions at all. But this was established to reassure the Unionists that their British identity would be respected. They're part of Britain, they're there with other devolved bodies in the United Kingdom, in Scotland and Wales, so they're not going to lose their British citizenship. And the argument here is that Northern Ireland is simply one devolved body in a multinational United Kingdom with devolution to Scotland and Wales. And it's fortunate in a way we have had devolution to Scotland and Wales from this point of view, otherwise Northern Ireland would stand out like a sore thumb as the only part which had devolution. But the fact you've got Scottish and Welsh devolution makes the Unionists perhaps feel a bit better. And so they can say the Belfast Agreement is not the first step on the road to a united Ireland. It's not a slippery slope, but that it will reconcile them to membership of the United Kingdom, and they're more likely to agree to links with the rest of Ireland if undertaken through an organisation which includes the rest of the United Kingdom. So it's a balancing act to reassure both sides. Now, when I spoke about devolution some time ago, I said that this created what I thought was a quasi-federal system of government within the United Kingdom, a system bearing some resemblances with, though not wholly similar to, a federal system as you have, for example, in Canada or Germany. Now, the British Irish Council extends this to create a loose confederal arrangement with the Irish Republic, a very loose arrangement. But so the settlement in Northern Ireland, unlike Scotland and Wales, is far more than simply devolution. It's more complex and constitutionally challenging because it's not only internal power sharing, which devolution is, but external power sharing between the British and Irish governments. It's something quite new in British experience, and we don't yet know how it'll work out. Now, the Belfast Agreement, to come into effect, needed to be approved in both Northern Ireland and in the Republic in referendums. And referendums were held in the same day. Now, the Irish Republic, as part of the agreement, agreed to delete from its constitution the provision laying claim to the whole of the island of Ireland. They said that would be deleted. And it's remarkable, the referendum was approved on a 54% turnout in the Irish Republic by 96% of the people, which showed that they'd accepted, in effect, the division of Ireland. Now, in Northern Ireland, it was again approved by a large majority, by 71%, on a fairly large turnout, 81%. And that's a great contrast to the other devolution referendums in Scotland and Wales, which had rather low turnouts. It showed there's more enthusiasm in Northern Ireland for that settlement than there was in Scotland and Wales. In Wales, it was just over 50% voting. And the large majority shows the agreement must have been approved by both communities, the majority Unionists and the minority Nationalists. Now, as a result of all this, elections were held to a new assembly in Northern Ireland in 1998. But as you know, this hasn't been the end of it, and it's taken 9 years to get the assembly working. The various problems arose, and it was in fact been suspended 4 times before yesterday because of the difficulties of getting bitter opponents to work together. Now, it now seems that it may work, and a lot has been said in the press about the bribes, if you like, to use a crude word, that have been offered to Ian Paisley to get him to agree extra money to Northern Ireland and all the rest of it. But I think there's another important fact. The British government said that if devolution doesn't work this time, it would be permanently suspended, and Northern Ireland would revert not to direct rule, but what they call joint stewardship by the British and Irish governments, because it will have been shown that Northern Ireland cannot govern itself, will have to be governed from outside. Now, joint stewardship is not exactly joint sovereignty, but nevertheless, the Unionists would be much more frightened of that than they would of agreeing to an internal settlement with Gerry Adams. And I think that was a much more important factor, actually, than the money, that they were told, this is your last chance, and if you don't agree, we'll bring the Irish government in, you won't have a return to direct rule, and this will be your last opportunity. However, even if, as we hope, devolution is restored, that is not the end of the problem, and I think the press are mistaken in giving the impression that it is. Because the coalition government, of course, that's going to be formed is one that unites 2 very diverse extremes. Will they actually be able to get together on the day-to-day business of legislation, or isn't to have put together a serious political programme, or is not stagnation more likely? Now, an even more serious problem is this. Suppose at the end of the 4 or 5 years, 4 years, I beg your pardon, when they're in government, suppose people say, well, all right, we're in favour of peace, of course, but we're a bit tired of this government. We'd like another government. There is no other government. There's no alternative government in Northern Ireland. It is, in a way, a suspension of the normal democratic framework because you can't get it in Northern Ireland because you have no alternating majority. You have no alternative majority. So people have to be governed, as it were, by Paisley and Gerry Adams, roughly, for ever and ever and ever. There can be no alteration. There might be a slight alteration in the balance in the Assembly, but not very much. And that doesn't make it easy to see how you could get good government going if there's really no alternative. Can a democracy operate without an alternative government? That seems to me a serious question. And so from that point of view, I think it's a mistake to believe that the conflict's ended, and perhaps it can never end, but at least it's now carried out in a non-violent form. And what seemed impossible a decade ago, perhaps even a few years ago, if one had said that Paisley would be sitting down with Gerry Adams, you'd have been thought to be a bit wild. But it is actually happening, and the IRA has renounced violence and accepted the rule of democracy, the ballot, not the bullet, and they've accepted a place in what they used to call a 6-county assembly, because they never recognised Northern Ireland. They thought it was illegitimate. And it's worth saying, amidst the euphoria, that all this could have been achieved over 30 years ago, because the Heath government set up a very similar power-sharing arrangement in Northern Ireland in 1973-4, and that was defeated by direct action by the unionist workers, the Protestant workers. The only case since the War of the Strike altering something, I think, major like that, the government was brought down, which Ian Paisley very strongly supported. And so he, I think, bears responsibility for the defeat of all the power-sharing arrangements over a period of 30 years and for igniting religious hatreds. Whereas the IRA or Sinn Féin could have got places in a 6-county assembly at any time if they'd been prepared to renounce violence over the past 30 years. And they said they were fighting for something different, not to recognise the 6 counties body, but to get a united Ireland, perhaps to bomb people into United Ireland, to create United Ireland by force. And perhaps the best comment about it all has been made to me by someone from Northern Ireland. He said the Unionists are too foolish to realise that they've won, and the nationalists are too clever to admit that they've lost. And that might be the best comment on this whole dreadful saga. Thank you very much. And now, as before, we'll have a series of questions if people would like to ask them. Yes.
Professor Bogdanor, just something on the Alliance Party. David Ford's lot did get more votes and more seats this last time. They're up to about 7 in Stormont. Next, small correction, the Deputy First Minister will be Martin McGuinness.
I beg your pardon, yes, of course. Thank you very much.
Jerry Adams.
Thank you. Jerry Adams, the president of Sinn Féin, but Martin McGuinness will be Deputy Prime Minister. Yes.
Exactly.
Yes, the Alliance got 7 seats out of 108.
Correct. So they're still very small, and they're not in government.
They're still very small. I mean, it's 7 out of 108 is what percentage? Your maths is probably better than mine. 1/15th.
Yeah. But the interesting thing also is the fact that the STV system used for their elections is also used for their elections to Westminster.
Yeah, indeed. Not to Westminster, to the European Parliament.
And Westminster.
No, the Westminster MPs are elected by
I
first
apologise
past
for
the
that.
post.
But Jeremy Thorpe once made the comment that you had to be Catholic or a terrorist in the United Kingdom to get proportional representation.
Yes, well, but it's not first past the post. The only election first past the post in Northern Ireland is to Westminster. All the other elections are by STV.
I thought in 1921 provision was made that if a majority in the North became Catholic, then there could be a referendum.
No, not a referendum. This provision, sort of provision, came in 1949. What happened was that Ireland gradually moved away from all her ties with Britain, and in 1948, Ireland left the Commonwealth. And in response to that, the Attlee government passed the Ireland Act, saying that Ireland shall under no circumstances cease to be part of the United Kingdom without a vote of the Parliament of Northern Ireland, entrenching the power of the Parliament of Northern Ireland. Now, when that Parliament was abolished in the 1970s, this was replaced by a vote. Northern Ireland shall not cease to be part of the United Kingdom without a vote of the people of Northern Ireland in a border poll. And one was held in 1973, which the Catholics boycotted, and therefore there was a strong majority for it. But all British governments have said since then that the principle of consent applies, and that if ever that Northern Ireland remains in the United Kingdom only because of consent, and that if ever that consent goes, they would join the Republic. But in a sense, that doesn't solve the problem, because the question is, how do we govern Northern Ireland in the absence of consent to join the Irish Republic? If that consent isn't there, how do we govern Northern Ireland? Yes?
Have the Ulster Unionists and the SDLP got a future, or are
Who knows?
the PC and Adams going to be outflanked?
Well, who knows? I mean, who can answer this question? But I think the logic of the system is that there are no gains from being a moderate, because you can always say your community is being sold out and that the extremists can get a better deal than the moderates, because the moderates are making a settlement, the extremists say we can get a better settlement. You can never refute that argument. There are no votes in the centre, so, I mean, who knows?
Professor Bogdanor, you did refer to the birth rate, the contrasting birth rates of Catholic and Protestant communities in Northern Ireland, which at the time of the initiation of that province left a 2-to-1 majority for the Protestants. And of course, since then, there has been a readjustment of that balance. But in the future, if the birth rate among Catholics were to continue to be higher than the Protestants, and in the end, the population of nationalists were to outnumber the population of unionists, do you think that there would be an acceptance of a will among the majority of people to join the Republic?
Well, I think, I mean, this is unlikely, I think, because it's now about 60-40, and demographic projections seem to show it's not likely that there'll be a Catholic majority. But if there was, the problem would be the other way around, because the problem would be for the Irish Republic how to accommodate a large minority of Protestants who didn't want to be there. They'd have to work some similar arrangement about government in reverse with an Irish-British council and all the rest of it. It wouldn't simply solve the problem, but it's unlikely to happen in the near future, I think.
Yes, numbers of countries have left the Commonwealth, and you indicated in the late 40s. There were some discussions, were there not, about whether the Irish Republic might want to come back into the Commonwealth, and I wonder, just to add to the complications of the mix, your thoughts on that?
No, well, that would help the problem, I think, considerably. It would reduce the fears of the Protestants if Ireland rejoined. And the reason they didn't want to remain in the Commonwealth was that they didn't want to recognise the King of England as then was. But now you don't have to, because India, which joined the Commonwealth shortly after Ireland left, was a republic, so it doesn't matter. But it would certainly help the problem if Ireland were to rejoin the Commonwealth.
You said that it was the Anglo-Irish Treaty that established Northern Ireland in 1921, but surely it was the Government of Ireland Act of the previous year, which, as you say, gave Northern Ireland a Home Rule Parliament. So in effect, before Ireland was partitioned in 1921, Northern Ireland had a functioning Parliament and government already.
Yes, it did, but the treaty, in theory, could have, and indeed at one point it seemed as if it might end the partition of Ireland, but it didn't. But as you say, the Lloyd George government first tried Home Rule on both parts of Ireland, hoping that would solve the problem. The South rejected it and resorted to guerrilla warfare, and the North didn't want it, but realised, as you said, it would be a form of entrenchment against a united Ireland. But one of the arguments about the treaty on the Irish nationalist side was that it left partition there. I mean, Lloyd George got round this with a very cunning trick, which is perhaps the only way you could get round it, because he said that he would establish a boundary commission, or a boundary commission would have been established to look at the boundary of Northern Ireland. And he said different things to the Conservatives, the Unionists, and the Nationalists. To the Unionists, he said it would look at the whole area. Now, since the whole area was Protestant, there wouldn't be any problem. But to the Nationalists, he said it would look at it district by district and village by village, and this would mean that the outlying Catholic areas would move to the Republic, or rather the Irish part, and there wouldn't be much of a Protestant bit left. And he said to the Nationalists, don't worry, the Boundary Commission will do the job for you. It'll so weaken Northern Ireland, it won't exist anymore. But of course, by the time that Boundary Commission was set up, Northern Ireland was entrenched anyway. But he said different things to different people, which perhaps was the only way you could settle the problem, and so they each took from him what they wanted.
Yes, I have a question and a comment. The question is, in the title of your lecture, it was, I think it was Gladstone Revisited, and I just wonder, the impression I got was the situation at the moment, right, it's a revisitation of Gladstone's solution. So could you just say a bit more about that, please?
So, sorry, I missed what you were saying, I beg your pardon.
In the title you mentioned Gladstone Revisited.
Oh, yes,
right,
well...
And that's my question.
Well, it's interesting, because I remember I gave a lecture some years ago on Ireland to young liberals, sort of very radical people, and one of them said to me, well, you can't really claim to be talking in the Gladstonian tradition because you're arguing in favour of partition on the grounds of consent, and Gladstone was in favour of a united Ireland. Now, I said, well, yes, but you're not Gladstonian either, because you're in favour of an independent Ireland, and Gladstone was not. He said that he quoted a famous comment from an Irish nationalist leader. He said the sea forbids unity. The ocean forbids unity, but the sea forbids separation. In other words, you had to transcend the simple categories of either being independent or not independent. If you were going to get a solution, you had to have some form of power sharing. And he said, you can have a united Ireland within the United Kingdom if you give it very wide devolution. And you might get the Protestants perhaps to accept that, which was probably wrong. But if Ireland becomes independent, the Protestants will never accept that. On the other hand, the Catholics will never accept direct rule from Westminster. So, in a sense, you're looking for a middle way. And what we've now found, the Irish government has found, independence isn't a solution. It doesn't solve the problem for the Catholics in Northern Ireland with their Irish identity. So you have to find a middle way, as it were, between independence and domination, if you like, with some form of power sharing. So it's in that sense that it's a Gladstonian solution, I think. It's applying a form of power sharing internally and also a form of power sharing externally. It's in that sense, I think.
And if I could make a comment, when you were saying about the difficulty of having Protestants and Catholics voting either for Labour or for Conservatives. You then said, whereas in Glasgow you don't have the problem of Protestants and Catholics voting for the Labour Party or not. And coming from the west coast of Scotland, you would find that the Labour Party is identified with Catholics. And I don't think Glasgow was a very good example of the point you're making, although I can understand the point itself.
Well, that was so much more in the past, it's true. And there was division on Glasgow Council till about the 1960s, I think, between Protestants and Catholics. But that isn't so much so now, and the division isn't as great. It's merged with other things. But going back to your point about Gladstone, it's a middle way between complete union, which is impossible, and independence, complete independence, which doesn't solve the problem, because however you draw the line, you've got a disaffected minority, so you have to have links between Britain and Ireland. Simply cutting one part off doesn't solve it. That's what I meant by a Gladstonian solution, really.
What I wanted to ask was, with Paisley being now the Affairs Minister and Martin McGuinness being the Deputy Affairs Minister, what is the political status in this setup now of Gerry Adams?
I don't know what position he's taking. Perhaps you know this. I don't know what position. He's the president of Sinn Féin. I don't know what position he's taking in the government. I see. Let me have just one more question, and I'll take one of my polls at the end of it. One of my opinion polls. Just one more. Sorry, I think we sort of stopped.
Two closely related questions. First of all, what methods do you think the nationalists were entitled to use to further their political objectives, given that the partition and the severe forms of discrimination and the seeming ineffectiveness of usual political methods? So what methods were they entitled to use? And the second related question is, what political effects do you think the use of violence has had in Northern Ireland?
Well, a great Irish nationalist leader, Parnell, in the 19th century, said that in Ireland violence is the only way to get a hearing for moderation. And I think you may argue this proved true in Northern Ireland in the 1960s, but now, even apart from the arrangements of government which I mentioned, you do have the protections, firstly, of the Human Rights Act, the European Convention of Human Rights, but Northern Ireland has its own additional Bill of Rights, and there's a very complicated and powerful machinery of minority protection there, and I don't now think that discrimination is a serious problem. I think there are many ways of dealing with that. I think now that all the constitutional channels are there to get redress of grievances, which I think wasn't the case in the 60s. I don't justify violence then either, but one can understand how it occurred. In fact, it's fair to say, the original civil rights marches were in no sense violent, and they were broken up by very rough and brutal police methods. So, it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. But let me conclude by a poll. I mean, how many people think this will be a settlement, and how many think there won't be? How many think it will be a permanent settlement in Northern Ireland, these current arrangements? It's a very rough opinion poll. How many think not? Oh, it's about half and half. It's about half and half, which is probably right, because we don't know. Well, my next lecture will try and draw all the threads together of where the Constitution is heading. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.